Thank you so much. I couldn't be more excited to be here. My name is David Wiss, and I'm a dietitian. I'm also a fourth-year doctoral student at UCLA in the School of Public Health. I want to thank the Center for Healthy Sex for giving me an opportunity to share some of my research. So I am an academic, and today this presentation is a little bit on the scholarly side. I am going to blow through a lot of data pretty quickly. I always intend to provide more than I'm going to talk about, and we have decided that we will make the slides, a PDF of the slides, available to attendees after the meeting via email. I'm also a private practice dietitian here in West LA. I'm the founder of Nutrition and Recovery, so I'm split between academics and working with people one-on-one, and we do run groups in treatment centers. I have no financial conflicts of interest. However, I will say that I'm biased. I do think that nutrition for mental health is the future. So look out for nutritional psychiatry and some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking to you about today. So I'm from West LA. I went to public school. I did my undergrad at USC in social science. I did my master's of science at Cal State Northridge. I did a thesis around nutrition and substance abuse. I did a dietetic internship in the eating disorders unit, and then founded the group practice and have been at UCLA since 2017. I don't have any nutrition agendas. I do think that if someone's going to be talking nutrition, they might need to disclose if they have a particular way of eating. So I do want to state that I have no particular style of eating that I promote. The work that I do is grounded in the biopsychosocial model. This is an effort to integrate all these different components from the subatomic and bacterial level all through the individual personal level to the community and to the planetary level, an effort to integrate all these levels and think about things as a system. I'm also interested in discipline bias. So I've noticed that, biological theories focus on things like, genes and neuroscience and microbiome, and psychology, as many of you know, looks at different attachments and family systems. Sociology looks at, population health rather than individual health. I notice that, often you'll get two of these theories happening at once, but very rarely do you get all three. So we're going to try to do all three today. However, the main gist of today's talk is going to be focused on the biological embedding of adversity, but we are going to put it into context. One of my academic heroes is Dr. Nancy Krieger, who's a social epidemiologist who really coined the term embodiment as an integration of lived experiences into physical reality. Most people know the book from Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. That might focus a little more on individuals, where in public health, we focus more on populations. We're also going to take a life course perspective today. This is a very broad way of understanding human health and development. We look at multiple pathways over the life course and how these can accumulate. Life course perspective not only looks at risk factors, but also looks at how things can be advantageous or protective over time. Today, we're going to focus on early life adversity. I stand on the shoulder of giants. I'm really fortunate to be at UCLA, where some really important work has been done. There's a phrase that we use, and it's, how does an unhealthy environment get under the skin? This is a perfect example of a biopsychosocial approach, considering how stress and allostatic load, which we're going to talk about today, which is biology, mental distress, psychology, coping skills and resources, that's the sociology, and health habits and behaviors, eventually can get under the skin to create health disorders. We are going to talk about eating disorders today. So it's always important to contextualize risk. So if you think about genetic factors that are predisposing factors for health outcomes, you always want to put it into the context of the family. The risky families model looks at how these things combine to create risky environments that can alter the way humans respond to stress, essentially alter biological systems, create risky health behaviors, and lead to mental and physical health problems over the life course. As I mentioned, today we're going to focus on biology. The early psychosocial environment could be infant, adolescence. It could even be in utero. We're not going to talk about in utero today, but I do think it's an important area of investigation that I'm learning more and more about. Early life adversity technically goes through the first 17 or 18 years of life, but the timing of adversity does seem to matter a bit, and we'll touch on that today as well. So if you look at these potential biological changes, we have epigenetic changes, which we're going to cover, specifically DNA methylation. Epigenetics is how genes are either turned on or turned off. We're going to talk about how neurobiology is altered, whether that be the functional connectivity in the brain, neurotransmitters. We're going to talk about the HPA axis, that's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the human stress response leading to an output of cortisol, and we're going to be talking about inflammation. As you might know, a genotype is an inherited trait that is in the genes, whereas a phenotype are the outward characteristics that are expressed. Now, this is an important concept. There's a theory called the theory of latent vulnerability, which I think is super important. Considers how genes interact with an early adverse environment to create a phenotype. So we're going to try to answer this question today. Why is it that some people can be exposed to trauma, adversity, and some people are more resilient and have a lower risk of a psychiatric disorder, whereas others are less so and are at heightened risk for health outcomes? The possible changes that can occur can be in the reward processing. That's the dopamine system that we're going to talk about today. Threat processing, which happens mostly in the amygdala, and memory processing, which happens in the hippocampus. So if you think about vulnerability factors or susceptibility factors, we often think about biology. But in life course research, we also need to think about resilience factors. Why can some people bounce back from exposures easier than others? And of course, that's a biopsychosocial process. However, when I think about resilience, I have a tendency to think about social factors. So access to social support, treatment, etc. And these are important pieces of this overall puzzle. So this is an overview of what we're covering today. We're going to look at early life adversity and focus on sexual abuse and how that can become embodied, also referred to as biologically embedded, and how that can affect mental health outcomes over the life course. In public health, we always look at socioeconomic status, and I won't be covering a lot of that today, but it's important as it goes in every single one of my conceptual models. We are going to talk about some pretty sensitive language today. The term obesity has kind of come under fire recently. At the individual level, some people don't like it, but in research, it is the term that we use. So you will see that word. We are going to talk about food addiction a little bit today. There's a lot of misconceptions there, and I hope to clear some of them up. And of course, we're going to be talking about sexual abuse as only one form of adversity. I do want to say that there's a lot of forms of adversity that can occur outside the home, but when we define child maltreatment, we're typically talking about 4, and these occur oftentimes in the home: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, psychological abuse, and neglect. Sexual abuse is defined as the involvement of a child in sexual activity that he or she does not fully comprehend, is unable to give informed consent to, or for which the child is not developmentally prepared, or else that violates the laws or social taboos of society. Children can be sexually abused by both adults and other children who are, by virtue of their age or stage of development, in a position of responsibility, trust, or power over the victim. So I want to clear this up early so that we don't run into any misconceptions. I think what's probably true is that the classic eating disorder approach is typically, run by clinicians. And so there's a lot more body positive, inclusive, non-shaming, non-stigmatizing language. Whereas in food addiction, it's often done in 12-step communities as well as lay public kind of coaches. So people that look at these different realms tend to associate food addiction with diet culture and weight loss and restriction. And I will say that, there is some support for that. We definitely see a little bit of that. But those of us that do research on food addiction are absolutely not looking at it from this lens. We are looking at it more as a neurobiological construct that informs the way we think about eating behavior. So it actually turns out that understanding food addiction decreases stigma rather than increases it. So what I like to propose is that as we understand neurobiology more, we can decrease the stigma associated with quote unquote personal control. And there's several studies on this that show that, participants are less stigmatizing and blaming of quote unquote food addictive targets. So I always say out with the personal responsibility and in with the neurobiology. The Yale Food Addiction Scale was validated in 2008 It used DSM-4 criteria for substance dependence, basically uses the criteria for quote unquote addiction and applies it to food. It looks at abnormal desires for sweet, salty, and fatty foods. It's been updated to the YFAST 2.0 for the DSM-5. There's a modified version, there's a version for children, and there's versions in dozens of countries for use worldwide. The biggest criticism of the Yale Food Addiction Scale is that it doesn't control for dietary restraint. So we know people that engage in dieting behavior have higher levels of food addiction, and I'm going to attempt to circle back to that point today. The food addiction literature really blew up in 2007. You could see the growth of the citations that are indexed in the scientific literature. I will say since 2015, there's probably been about 100 articles per year. The psychometric properties of the scale are really strong, and it's been validated and accepted worldwide. Now, here's our main point for today. I'm gonna try to update a theory which has been around for quite a while. I think it's safe to call it a mainstay psychoanalytic thought. And this is the idea that individuals who are exposed to substance abuse will deliberately and or subconsciously increase their food consumption in order to gain weight, thus avoiding the likelihood of future sexual victimization. And this has been supported by anecdote and certainly people in the field. You hear things like being overweight in some ways felt safe. When I lost weight and started getting sexual attention, I was horrified and eating more. I did a quick Google search and I saw there's a lot of blog articles on this. It says sexual abuse victims struggle to lose pounds put on as a protective measure. So I'm going to refer to this as the protective measure theory. And I'm going to add to it based on what we know about the biological embedding of adversity. I want to say that just because something is sometimes true or often true does not mean it's always true, and that mental health disorders always present with heterogeneity. Even when they appear textbook, there are always nuances. So we want to be careful in treatment about extrapolating, assuming that existing trends will continue, thinking like this works for me, so it should work for you. This is what my other client experienced, so it must be what your experience. And very strong all language, like eating disorders are all about thinness or restriction or control. I always encourage people to be careful what you learn from manuals. You want to start there, but then develop a clinical intuition. The ACE research, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, changes the way we understand addiction. This came in the late 90s from managed care in San Diego. This was in the Kaiser system. The most salient findings were that those that were exposed to 4 or more ACEs had a 7-fold increase in self-identifying as alcoholic, up to 5-fold increase in using illicit drugs, and a 10-fold increase in ever injecting drugs. So this really set the stage for the link between trauma and addiction. This diagram comes from the CDC, considers both historical trauma as well as situational trauma, and you can see it all leads into a disrupted neurodevelopment, which is going to be the focus of our talk today. I do want to say that ACE score has been integrated into California. So this is as of 2020. It took 22 years for the research to actually make a difference. Primary care physicians are able to screen for ACEs. This is a updated ACE scale that you can see. You see questions like, people going to prison, feeling unsupported, caregiver with mental health issues, problems with drugs, lacking appropriate care, being screamed at, pushed, grabbed, thrown down, etc. And you can see question 9 is the single question about sexual abuse, and they give some examples. There's also expanded ACEs in the California approved ACE measure. You see questions about, victimization in the neighborhood, discrimination, housing problems, socioeconomic questions, etc. Now, there's a lot of controversy here. It's possible that screening for ACEs could erode client, patient, or parent relationship. People might be scared about referring to child protective services. One solution is, identifying the number of ACEs without identifying the specific ACE. There's also the potential for an expectancy effect. Once someone is labeled high risk, people can start looking for aberrant behavior to confirm their predicted poor outcomes. And the biggest criticism is that we don't yet have established interventions available. So in public health, we say, don't screen if you can't treat. I like the EDISR measure better. It doesn't just ask one single question about sexual abuse. You can see here, there's 6. So they ask more specific questions about the types of sexual abuse. So this creates a little bit more nuance for researchers who are able to ask more questions. The child trauma questionnaire is also highly used. You can see question number 3 asks about a traumatic sexual experience, but then there's additional specifiers asking how old were you, how traumatic was it, and how much did you confide in others. This is the paper that really kind of woke me up and got me scratching my head. It's a systematic review from 2018, 17. These authors found a link between ACEs and obesity. However, none of the articles described any interventions that had anything ACE specific. So they provided some recommendations, things like tailored interventions for those with ACEs, trauma-informed therapy, considering contextual factors in addressing stigma. One of my mentors, Dr. Timothy Brewerton, who's a pioneer in the link between trauma and eating disorders, was one of the first to propose food addiction as being part of this puzzle. And we've done a lot of work together, and I'm going to develop this idea a little bit further. This textbook that came out in 2014 really pushed forward the conversation around overlapping addictions and eating disorders, and really promoted the role of integrated treatment rather than sequential. So oftentimes people that have co-occurring addictions and eating disorders are treated and they oscillate between the treatments. I think there's been a big push towards looking at these things concurrently, and I'm certainly part of those treatment efforts. In 2017, we published a paper which really tried to integrate some of the newer research on food addiction into the eating disorder community to reduce some of the confusion around food addiction and help certain people achieve sustainable recovery. And then more recently, we did a systematic review and meta-analysis of the link between ACEs and adult obesity. After pooling over 100,000 subjects, we found that there's a roughly 46% increase in the odds of adult obesity. We did discuss some biologically plausible explanations, which we'll talk about today. And we looked for authors' efforts to explain why this might happen. You see oftentimes authors mention social support, health behaviors like eating, sleep, the chronic stress response, and less than half of the authors mentioned neurobiology. So very few of the authors identified neurobiological changes as a link. So we went on to develop these ideas further. You could see this is the meta-analysis. When you pool all of the different studies, we get a pretty stable estimate. So I'm going to attempt to answer this question today. Is food addiction a biologically plausible mechanism linking early life adversity to adult obesity? You can see in the diagram, I've lumped stress, trauma, and adversity together. Biological embedding has multiple forms, and I'm going to cover those today. And I do want to add that there's other pathways as well. So if you look at a more overview type model, some people might go from early life trauma to addiction like eating to obesity, but very often others might go from here to bulimia nervosa to a lower weight, and also to substance use disorder, sometimes stimulants as well as opioids, etc. So my work is interested in the intersection of eating disorder, substance use disorder, and other aberrant eating behaviors. I don't think weight's the only outcome of interest, but in research, sometimes we got to go with things that are quantifiable. I do want to put it into more context. So if we think about this link between trauma, food addiction, and obesity, it's also really important to consider the role of socioeconomic status, how that can drive trauma, and how that can affect the food environment, and how that can affect addiction like eating. It's also very important to consider that we live in an era, in a world where there's still a lot of stigma around obesity, and I'm proposing that stigma is also a form of psychosocial stress and a trauma. It also can lead to dietary restraint, which can increase addiction like eating. So we're going to do a couple of studies, and I'm going to share some of the data to hopefully get a large overview of where we're headed. This is an umbrella review from the Lancet. This is when they pool the meta-analysis. The outcome is sexual abuse. The outcomes are listed here. The exposure is sexual abuse. Let me correct that. You could see that they've pooled a lot of data to get some very stable estimates. So I've highlighted the ones that I'm of interest with, but you could see eating disorders are increased by over twofold risk, right? When there's childhood sexual abuse. Obesity is 1.4, so that's a 40% increase, very consistent with our estimates. This is a nationally representative sample that looks at these different forms of childhood maltreatment. And I do want you to notice that the prevalence is higher for women than men in all of the categories. So I don't know if this is due to reporting bias or if it's actually true that women are exposed to more neglect and abuse. But if you look at sexual abuse, you can see women are much higher than men, and I don't think that would be surprising. Nationally representative data linking child maltreatment to eating disorders show that exposure to childhood maltreatment increases the odds of all of the eating disorders. Once you focus specifically on sexual abuse, we see that anorexia is increased by 2-fold, binge eating disorder is increased by 3-fold. So if you were to look at all of the different types of child maltreatment, you'll see that binge eating disorder is always higher than anorexia nervosa. It does kind of maybe support the protective measure theory a little bit. It turns out that people who are exposed to traumatic events early in life are way more likely to binge than be restrictive. If you look at the systematic review and meta-analysis, we actually see that bulimia nervosa has the highest estimate. So those that are exposed to childhood sexual abuse have an almost 3 times increased risk of having bulimia. It's about 2.3 for binge eating and less than 2 for anorexia nervosa. Now this is where it gets interesting. When you separate those that are anorexia nervosa restrictive type and those that are binge purge type, you see that childhood sexual abuse is not associated with anorexia nervosa restrictive type. So there's something about the binge that's important for trauma. And I'm going to say that it's likely related to the dopaminergic reward system. It's also important to know that overweight and obesity has been associated with men, but not women. However, the weight management practices have been very similar. So if you look at childhood sexual abuse, men engage in dieting behavior, exercise, laxatives, diuretics, etc., very similar to women. However, women are more likely to be told by a doctor that they have an eating disorder. This really could, suggest that men are underdiagnosed and therefore not well captured by eating disorder research. In Finland, we have data to show that girls exposed to sexual abuse are more likely to be obese, yet they're also likely to demonstrate extreme weight loss behaviors. So the risk for engaging in extreme weight loss behaviors also kind of challenges the protective measure theory a little bit. Unhealthy weight control behaviors can eventually lead to eating disorders. So the risk associated with sexual abuse is about 2-fold. So my main point is that sexual abuse does increase the risk for obesity, and it's likely going through the food addiction pathway, but it really also increases the risk of bulimia nervosa, and we're going to talk about how that can actually happen. It's also very common, and I see this in my clinical practice, people are using stimulant medications for weight loss. So picture someone that was exposed to early life trauma, perhaps it's sexual abuse or another form, and they've gone through treatment and they were able to find a amphetamine or other stimulant that could help them control their weight, and there's a lot of abuse potential. So this is worth mentioning as well. Once you separate certain measures, which is the EDEQ, which we use for eating disorder research, you can separate the different concerns. So sexual abuse is associated with an increase in eating concern, but not so much with weight or shape concern. So again, this is somewhat contrary to the protective measure theory, which has been around for so long. Key point for today, all forms of childhood maltreatment are associated with all forms of eating disorders. And this comes from systematic review and meta-analysis. The estimates are very similar. If you look here, it doesn't really matter what the form of childhood maltreatment it is. They lead to binge type eating disorders across the board. However, there does appear to be something about sexual abuse and obesity. There are increased risk studies that have shown that. However, when you take it to systematic review, the data says not really. All forms of abuse lead to obesity. You could see physical abuse, 28% increase, emotional 36, sexual abuse 31, and general abuse 45. So this starts to, make people scratch our heads and wonder, what are the actual mechanisms at play? There is definitely something about sexual abuse and extreme obesity. This paper, instead of using the 30 BMI cut point, used the 40 BMI cut point. And I'd like to propose that perhaps there's an interaction between the biological embedding, which we're going to talk about today, and the protective measure theory. So the protective measure theory is not wrong, it's just not complete. When we look at longitudinal data of over 2,000 children, we see that adverse relationship and victimhood events in the recent past were related to a lower BMI in young adults. So oftentimes people engage in the dieting behavior, whereas adverse health events during childhood are related to a higher BMI. So here it is. The earlier the event, the more likely the outcome is obesity, and this indicates biological embedding over the life course. Children who are abused don't gain weight right away. So the data shows that the accumulation of ACEs and other childhood adversity don't increase childhood weight right away, but it does increase them over the life course. So let's start bringing in some of these new ideas. We have data, food addiction data, like I said, has really blown up in the last 5 years, really since 2007. We have data from Brazil, large data sets that show food addiction is independently associated with exposure to early life psychological and sexual abuse. Now, this makes a lot of sense if you think about it for a minute. Early life adversity predicts substance use disorders, and there's a ton of neurobiological overlap between substance use disorders and other addictions, including food addiction, so it makes a lot of sense that this would be so. Large data sets from the US have shown that severe physical and severe sexual abuse were associated with a roughly 90% increase in food addiction risk. So this new construct, this new scale that they created in Yale is being used to try to understand the mechanisms. Now, I do want to point out, if you look at these risk ratios, these are the estimates, it's pretty similar for physical abuse and for sexual abuse. So I guess what I really want to emphasize is that it doesn't matter that much what the trauma type is, they all lead to addiction-like behaviors. And this has been shown recently in a publication in JAMA, which is a very well-known journal. The prevalence of food addiction increased the number of lifetime PTSD symptoms, and women with the greatest number of PTSD symptoms had more than twice the prevalence of food addiction as women with neither PTSD nor trauma histories. So this study found that the PTSD food addiction association did not differ substantially by trauma type. So all forms of trauma increase risk for food addiction. We have data with bariatric surgery seeking patients that higher levels of ACE scores increase likelihood of food addiction. Screening positive for ACEs relates to the severity of food addiction. And there's several more studies, but I just showed you a few of the more recent ones. So let's go there. Let's talk about the potential mechanisms by which this adversity can become embedded. I'm going to talk about inflammation, microbiome, epigenetics, the HPA axis. I'm going to try to focus on the dopamine system because we're talking about addiction. And I'm also going to show some neuroimaging data as well. I want to say rest in peace to Dr. Bruce McEwen, who died a few months ago. He was a pioneer in the stress research field. He really coined this term allostatic load. You could see he proposed the social context plus the stressor and the registration of threat by the brain leads to a biological response, and it lends itself to the release of several inflammatory mediators, and this was collectively referred to as allostatic load. Allostasis describes the body's adaptations to predictable or unpredictable changes in the environment. The original study used these measures here. Essentially what they do to do this kind of research is you dichotomize the variable. It's either above the cut point or below the cut point. And if people are above the cut point, you get a point, and then it creates an index. So if people are high on a lot of these different biomarkers, they have a higher allostatic load. You know, more recently, there's new inflammatory markers on the scene, but the couple of things that are almost always there, things like cortisol, C-reactive protein is a popular inflammatory marker. This is a pretty hot area of research, and a lot of it did come out of UCLA. This is important. This is where it gets good. Early life stress affects the brain in ways that increase pro-inflammatory markers. Specifically, cytokines is where I've been focusing on. This creates a low-grade peripheral inflammation in the body, and we have data to show that inflammation can cross the blood-brain barrier and lend itself to what we call neuroinflammation, and the neuroinflammation can create risky health behaviors, and this is by altering the dopamine system. Dopamine is involved in reward processing, and it plays a central role in incentive motivation, reward-based learning, and motor control. This came from the journal Biological Psychiatry, which is probably my favorite journal. So neuroinflammation is a hot topic. It's a big topic with neurodegenerative disease. This is from an alcohol-related paper that can show that neuroinflammation can really start in the gut, lend itself to increase in inflammatory markers, which can cross the blood-brain barrier. And the data suggests that the inflammation can occur at the amygdala. So this, if you're aware, is a very important part of the brain, which governs our threat receptivity and threat vigilance, and is very important for those of us that study trauma. The microbiome I could talk about for a long time, but I'm going to keep it really brief today. We know that when someone is in a balanced state, aka symbiosis, they have a lot of bacterial diversity. So there's a lot of healthy strains. The mucosal barrier, which is the intestinal lining, is intact. The immune system's working. Once there's exposures to stress, whether it be from poor diet or from life stressors, people can lose bacterial diversity. They can increase the permeability of their gut lining. This is often referred to as leaky gut, and then can end up in a state of altered symbiosis where there's less diversity of the microbes, more oxidative stress, and sustained low-level inflammation. A lot of people live here and aren't even aware of it, which really emphasizes how important nutrition could be. So neuroinflammation is the future. This is a really hot topic. How do stressors that occur in the body travel to the brain, and how does the brain then affect our health behaviors, right? Another important pathway, which I'm only going to touch on briefly, is the vagus nerve. This is the largest nerve in the autonomic nervous system. It connects the brainstem to the various organs, most known for its connection to the gut. So it's part of what we call the gut-brain axis. It's a bidirectional communication. There's a lot of research happening with the vagus nerve. And what I can say is what happens in Vegas does not stay in Vegas, right? There's a lot of communication happening throughout the body. And this is particularly important for people with bulimia nervosa. It turns out that purging changes vagal tone and helps people feel quote unquote relaxed often, especially when there's a history of trauma. So I think there'll be some innovative treatments in this area coming soon. So here's what we know. PTSD is a systemic illness. It is related to inflammation. There's a lot of somatic pathology, and this is a really important area of inquiry. This is looking for the biological signature of PTSD, and there's some really important work happening here. I'm going to move on and talk about epigenetics. I think I introduced it early on, but I want to bring it back. Genetics is our genetic code, which we get from our parents. Epigenetics is how genes can become plastic and how they can be altered through different exposures. So we know that certain genes can be turned on and turned off over the life course. And some really interesting research has looked at DNA methylation, which is an enzymatically catalyzed modification of DNA. And this type of research is very expensive, so very difficult to do, but there's been some really big studies. One of them came from 2009. They looked at the hippocampus from suicide victims with a history of child abuse, and those from either suicide victims with no child abuse or a control group. And there was significant differences in the hippocampal glucocorticoid receptor. That's the NR3C1 site. It is significantly impacted by adversity. There's been a large body of research on this area showing that stressors and adversity can affect the epigenetic expression of the glucocorticoid receptor in the hippocampus. Now, let's talk HPA axis. It's a really confusing area. It took me a long time to feel like I really understood it. The hypothalamus is in the brain. It releases a hormone or a factor to the pituitary gland, which is also in the brain. It releases another signaling mechanism to the adrenals, which is above the kidney, and this releases glucocorticoids, which is in humans, cortisol. Now, if you look at this cascade, these steps, we have the hippocampus coming before it. So if you think about something, a trauma exposure affects a receptor in the hippocampus, think about how any little perturbation in any step along the way can essentially affect how human beings respond to stress. So these all have feedback loops, and I think it's safe to say that the HPA axis is a very promising area for understanding the biological embedding of adversity. This paper really shows three different important pathways. This burgundy pathway is the glucocorticoid HPA axis site that I'm describing. It's starting at the paraventricular nucleus and communicating to the, with cortico-releasing factor or hormone to the pituitary gland, and then eventually leading to cortisol. That's one pathway, that's the HPA axis. We also have the mesolimbic dopaminergic projection, which starts at the VTA, can communicate to the ventral striatum and through the prefrontal cortex. This is mostly the dopamine pathway. And these authors, who by the way, are incredible scholars. Whenever you see the name Mark Potenza, you know you're reading a good paper. He's from Yale. They've also included oxytocin as part of this picture. So let's talk about the link between ACEs and addiction. We know that ACEs affect dopamine receptor expression, particularly the D2 site. The dopamine D2 site has gotten a lot of attention, as well as dopamine production. This can affect the way that brains process rewards and can essentially lead to sensation seeking, novelty seeking, and risk taking behavior. We know that ACEs can alter this glucocorticoid receptor expression, can alter the way the amygdala responds and the human stress response, and lead to other mental health outcomes. And then, yes, the oxytocin is part of this overall picture as well. So here it is, the dopamine system. We know that early life stress affects the way that rewards are processed. So reward responsiveness is processed in the ventral striatum, and this is critical to our understanding of addictions, including food addiction. It's important to acknowledge that there's other forms of psychosocial stress other than childhood adversity, living in poverty in certain urban environments, ethnic minority status. All of these things can affect the connectivity in the brain. So this is how the brain communicates to other parts of the brain. It also is related to the white and the gray matter, and all of it can affect the way the brain processes salience. Now, salience is an important word in addiction research. It's the assignment of value to something. So it works with the memory to learn things. The dopamine system learns things. So when something is highly rewarding, the brain learns to do it again. So if someone has negative affect and they eat a meal, they're going to learn that this works to reduce the negative affect, and it's actually happening by way of the dopamine system. So the excitement really built when I saw this paper. This was, once you start bringing it to the PET scans and the functional MRI studies, things start to get really, really clear. It was shown in a small sample, but convincing nonetheless, that long-term exposure to psychosocial adversity reduces striatal dopamine. So you can see the high adversity group has lower dopamine than the low adversity group. And this one came out of UCLA not too long ago. fMRI data on 186 participants showed that those that had a high BMI had an association between early life adversity and food addiction. So those that had been exposed to adversity, reward regions in the brain were able to predict processed food consumption. This is not surprising based on what we know about addiction. So the data became very compelling. And this is when I realized I needed to update some of these old theories. We also know that ACEs increase impulsivity. We know that increased impulsivity leads to delayed discounting. This is someone's likelihood of taking a smaller, sooner reward over a larger, later reward. So people will pick the immediate choice to manage the immediate crises rather than the long-term goal. We have other fMRI data to show that trauma alters the corticolimbic circuitry. So here's the gist of it. The trauma group is less able to relax, and they're more vulnerable to engaging in risky behavior. This was a big paper in 2017. This is a meta-analysis that showed those that had been exposed to childhood adversity had decreased hippocampal volumes. And this was very convincing. It made statistical significance in the meta-analysis. There was a lot of papers that showed that early life abuse can increase the volume in the amygdala. Once they pooled the data, it did not meet significance, but I do want to say there's a lot of papers that show trauma increases the volume of the amygdala, and this can affect the way people process threats. So here's a good summary. Early life adversity affects structural variation in gray and white matter, which we didn't cover in much detail, but it also affects the way that brains talk to one another. So for example, the amygdala talking to the prefrontal cortex, and of primary importance, it affects neurotransmitter metabolism and production. So all of the pathways between the gut and the brain that we've covered today, they're all nutrition related. So nutrition is a very important part of this picture, and it has not gotten enough attention. So let's go there. What's the point? right? I believe that eating disorders treatment desperately needs to get out of the box. Some of the training is somewhat out. There's a lot of things that we're doing in the eating disorder world, right? Like reducing stigma, promoting body positivity, but there isn't enough emphasis on the stuff I'm talking about today: brain structures, gut health, the gut-brain axis. Eating disorder treatment's very well focused to deal with restrictive eating disorders, but not well equipped to deal with the non-restrictive type. We all know that dieting is a major risk factor for eating disorders, but the question that hasn't been answered, which I'm hoping to answer, is where does all the dieting come from in the first place? Why is it that so many people are attempting to diet? The major mainstay psychological theory is known as the transdiagnostic theory. This is for use with CBT. It proposed that the eating disorder diagnosis is not relevant to the treatment. But I'm saying that this assumption is very much challengeable in the light of what we know about food addiction. I'm a big believer in intuitive eating. It was a total revolution in the nutrition world. It's an assumption that we can trust our body wisdom. A lot of people that have chronic dieting need to get this message, right? To stop the food fight. And I'd like to say that if someone has low addiction, their gut's not impaired, their hormones are stable, and they're able to access mindfulness, yes, they're in sync with their intuition. But if someone has a significant trauma history, gut dysbiosis, inflammation, addiction, withdrawal, craving, hormonal extremes, and a lot of mindless behavior, it's safe to say that intuitive eating might not be an effective approach. So with nutrition, I'd like to say that we always have to think about biology. A calorie is not a calorie. Psychological and educational efforts by themselves are often not sufficient. We need an intervention. I'm talking about a public health intervention. A lot of people report that when they eat better, whether that means less processed foods or more whole foods or more regularly, that people feel better. We never really understood why, but guess what? Now we do. Many of the highly processed foods do have ingredients that negatively impact the gut, and this negatively impacts mental health. So if someone's intuitively eating a lot of things that are working against their biological healing, I think it's safe to say that it might not be getting them to where they need to be from the biological perspective. I do want to add that the psychological perspective is very important, and I'll talk about dietary restraint in a minute. But if someone's not eating enough fiber, I'm a big believer that we need to gradually and progressively reintroduce that. That might take a little bit of time, but it takes some attention from a qualified expert. It's also important to know that polyphenols, which occur in fruits and vegetables, are an important part of this picture as well. If you take fiber supplements, it's not the same thing as eating fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds. There's a synergy between the fiber and the polyphenols, which really reinforce the importance of eating real food. We do have data to show that probiotics can be effective in reducing depression. We don't really know which strains are good for which conditions. We still have a long way to go, but this is something that I do use in my clinical practice. We want to watch out for meal skipping, dieting, leaving the meal right after eating, laxative teas, weight loss, hiding food, talking about food, following fitness on social media, and being obsessed with the quality of food, which we call orthorexia. The big picture goals are typically not weight focused. We're talking about recovery, focusing on overall health, the body, the mind, and the spirit, behavior change, self-efficacy, learning how to cook, creating consistency with food. I tell people consistency with food leads to consistency with life. And eventually you want to help people develop a relationship with food and exercise that is intuitive and personal. Always avoid quick fixes. So as I mentioned, food addiction has a lot of detractors, and partially because when people are highly restrained with eating, it can increase food addiction symptoms. We recently wrote a chapter in a textbook to address this. Certainly happy to share people access to it. Hopefully you can find it online. But the main point is that misapplied restraint can actually make some people's eating pathology worse. So the way that some would quote unquote treat food addiction from a nutritional standpoint is a very, very important conversation, because oftentimes the approaches that are out there make people worse, not better. So what are some of the final thoughts? Food addiction treatment does not always require a rigid food abstinence. Sometimes behavioral abstinence does work better, but it might warrant reduced exposure. It does require recovery, and this means psychosocial support. Trauma must be healed, so we bring the body back in. Meditation, yoga, stuff that works through the vagal system. Brains can be wired, but it doesn't happen in days and weeks. It happens in months and years. I'm seeing things happen in 3 to 7 years. Always self-destructive black and white thinking should be challenged, But keep in mind that the composition of the food we eat does impact our gut, does impact our inflammatory cascade, and this in turn regulates our other mechanisms and affects our mental health. So I've been screaming this from the rooftop. We need to just look beyond quantity, and we do have to consider quality. And to summarize the biological embedding, we talked about the allostatic load, all these various body systems, the microbiome, the structural and functional morphology of the brain, the changes in the gene expression. Because we focus today on biology, I do want to say that the cumulative disadvantage that we study in social science has not gotten enough attention, but that's a very important part of this overall picture. It has been suggested that the impact of childhood sexual abuse is not always redeemable, and this is at the biological level, by subsequent experience. So it is important to think about timing, the critical and sensitive periods. I de-emphasize the type of adversity today. I kind of made it seem like it didn't matter which type of adversity. They all lead to food addiction and eating disorders, and in some cases, obesity. But with other outcomes, the type of adversity really does matter. The susceptibility factors matter, resilience factors, considering the other positive contextual factors, and gender seems to matter, particularly with respect to internalizing psychopathology versus externalizing psychopathology. So to summarize, ACEs can become embedded in multiple ways, including neurobiological adaptations. They can impact behavior patterns. ACEs are an upstream risk factor, more common and causal than many other public health issues. The effects of ACEs can be stable and long-term. Our society does bear a responsibility to protect children, particularly amidst these addiction crises. And I believe strongly, and this is the work that I'm doing, that early life adversity needs more attention in the policy arena. Future directions include the differences between different types of adversity, which we touched on today, the biological signature of PTSD, the role of impaired sleep in biological embedding, and how to manage impaired reward with respect to eating behavior. So this is kind of the little question that I hope some of you think about. Is moderation with food always the best thing? And I think it's safe to say that harm reduction is a very appropriate approach, but more and more people are saying that moderation does not work for them and they're having really, really poor outcomes. I think it is a good goal, but I think it's safe to say that eating disorders are heterogeneous and there isn't just one single nutritional approach. I think if we do trauma-informed treatment and we think about creative ways to heal the body, heal the gut, heal the brain, that will do much better. So people ask me all the time, Dave, what is your food philosophy? Well, I don't have one of those. I have many skills. I work with the whole range of disordered eating. I work with people that have substance use disorders, and I'm not married to a single food philosophy. I think having one food philosophy is more beneficial for the practitioner than it is for their clients. If all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So I encourage people to diversify their toolkit. Hopefully I gave you some tools today, some certain things to think about, trying to avoid being a one-trick pony, to always think about things on a spectrum, on a continuum, and in a non-binary fashion. I think it's safe to say that stigma is recovery's greatest enemy, and one of my main goals is to reduce stigma in the field of addiction and eating disorders. We see what we see on the surface. We see leaves, we see trees, we see branches, but there's a lot going on underneath in we call the root of the problem. In public health, we don't just look at the root of the problem, we look at the soil, all the other contextual factors which increase risk. And that's what I got. I'm really excited to answer any questions. If we don't get to all of them, here's my email address. You can email me. I'm happy to engage with you offline. Someone's asking about the term probiotics and psychobiotics. Can you explain? Yes, thank you. Probiotic is the bacteria itself. And we know that probiotics exist naturally in the GI tract. And then we want to make sure that probiotics have prebiotics, which are fibers. Essentially, I emphasized fiber in my talk today. And then what we now know happens is the fiber is broken down by the bacteria, and the bacteria convert that into short-chain fatty acids to neurotransmitters, and we're calling this postbiotics. So we have the bacteria, we have the food for the bacteria, and then we have the output per se. So when we talk about psychobiotics, those are things that lend themselves to substrates or outputs that eventually affect brain health. So there's a good book on it, and I think that might be what you're referring to. Someone's asking about a history of trauma affecting adrenal and cortisol systems. Yes, I think that's one of our main points today. Trauma can affect the HPA axis, which can affect the cortisol regulation over the life course. Some people are more resilient to it, some people less so. But cortisol is a hormone, and then it affects other hormones. So it can also affect insulin, and that can have a lot of implications for other metabolic diseases. Someone's asking, is it fair to say that all those who suffer from obesity have a history of trauma? Really interestingly, the original ACE study occurred because Dr. Folletti, the principal investigator of the ACE study, really had this lurking suspicion that there was a link between ACEs and obesity, and that's what drove his research. I don't think it's safe to make all statements. I think there's a lot of people that might live in a larger body that don't have significant trauma histories, but I think it's probably safe to say that because of the amount of stigma around living in a larger body, a lot of people experience trauma as a result of having obesity as opposed to a cause. So in research, we always want to look at what's a cause and what could be a consequence. So yes, I don't want to say that all do, but I think the link and the data that I presented is pretty strong. Someone's asking about their own personal exposures. Yeah, someone said I'm the exact opposite, right? Someone's in great physical shape. I think that goes to our point about resilience, right? Some people are going to find resilience factors, and the biological embedding is going to be redeemable. So we know that epigenetics can make changes. We don't know how reversible those changes are. We don't know how much yoga can change the stress response. We don't know how certain breathing techniques, those are all things that are being investigated, but it hasn't been shown how reversible biological embedding is and how long that could take. So I think it's safe to say that some people can be exposed to sexual abuse and other forms of early life adversity and, absolutely bounce back. I see a question is about food addiction. So I want to answer this. Someone said, for me as a food addict, the only thing that has worked from a lifetime of dieting is to identify my alcoholic foods, those that I hide, binge, crave, and eliminate. I've done this through OA, but I use the big book. Moderation would kill me. Yeah, that's something that I've seen enough of, and I just have to get behind it. There are certain people who are not going to be able to use the classic eating disorder approach, and that's the only thing that's going to work. It's a biological thing. Their dopamine system might be set up to where moderation won't be successful. And it's really a shame because a lot of these people are shunned by a lot of the eating disorder world. They're looked at as very diety. They're looked at as, promoting diet culture and restriction. And I think there's a lot of people that are just trying to survive and trying to reduce stigma. And I think it's important to understand the neurobiology of food addiction and really start to change the way we think about these things. Someone's asking about medications, working on the dopamine channel. I do want to say this, and I didn't talk about it much, but in the last 3 years, there's about a dozen or 24 papers that are showing how medications affect the microbiome. So a lot of medications that people use decrease bacterial diversity. And a lot of the times the weight gain associated with medication is not from eating more, it's from changes in the microbiome. So, that research is coming out of Ireland. It's, really fascinating. And it's just important to understand that not everything is a psychological construct. A lot of it is just basic biology. Someone's asking about the link between overweight and unsexually attractive versus the link between neurological changes as a result of ACEs that lead to overweight. You had slides about both. Can you give your thoughts on which may be more prevalent? Thank you for that. I tried to really cover, both theories today. This theory of people deliberately gaining weight as a protective measure, I think has been around for a long time. And I think that, it's going to be true in some cases. My efforts today were to challenge the assumption that it's true in all cases, right? So when a theory gets popular, I must have had 5 people say it to me in my office. They're like, my therapist told me that I eat because of this. And I remember scratching my head one day and I was like, do you think that's true? And she sat there and she said, no, I don't know. But her therapist had told it to her because her therapist learned about it as some, mainstay kind of theory. So that's when I said, you know what? Problems are way more heterogeneous, right? It can't be that this is always true. We need to be careful what we tell people. So I do think that theory is going to be true for some people and become true for some people. But what I aimed to do today was to add to it by looking at the biology of it as opposed to just the psychology of it, and saying that there are going to be a lot of cases where the biological embedding leads to addiction like eating, which can lead to obesity against someone's desires and can also lead to binge type eating disorders as well as drug addiction. So hopefully I made it clear. I'm not taking a strong position on either one, but I do think it's safe to say that that old theory is just that, it's a little old. Someone's asking about the limitations of 12-step programs and ED treatment. What should people do with food addiction to recover? Great question. I don't think that there's a solution, right? Some people use these really rigid meal plans. Other people just need to work toward healing. My treatments that I do when I know people have food addiction typically do not involve weight loss. They're involving eating a lot of the right kinds of foods, getting people to be consistent with their eating, eating regularly throughout the day, never getting too hungry, never getting too full, engaging recovery. And then in time, we could figure out what direction to go from there. If you do things that are super rigid, most people fail. So I have endorsed rigid approaches with some people because it's the only thing that'll work. But more often, I'm working with people to understand their relationship to food, to not be too restrained in their eating, and to eat a lot of foods that are going to be healing to their biology. Someone's asking about chewing gum. Yeah, a lot of people ask about this. I want something in my mouth. I'm in recovery from binge eating. I'm anti-artificial sweetener. I want to say that. I'll make a statement there. I'm against artificial sweeteners. So a lot of times gums have artificial sweeteners in them. They do negatively affect gut bacteria. So I try to get people off artificial sweeteners. A lot of times in some of those restrictive, low carb things, people are cutting out fruit and eating artificial sweeteners. And I just scratch my head. I can't think of anything that's more wrong to do than to cut out fruit and eat a bunch of artificial sweeteners and gum. You do want to eat real food. Someone's asking about trauma healing modalities. Someone asked about EMDR. I think that there's a lot of different things that work for different people. I'm a big fan of regular use of yoga. I've seen some good results with some sensory motor psychotherapy. Someone's asking about foods and nutrients that help foster resilience and distress tolerance. Such a great question. I know there's not a magic pill, but how can you help cultivate resilience? I think that the answer to that question is you want to be as anti-inflammatory as possible. And that's going to be different from person to person. Sometimes, with people, we do a food sensitivity test, which can identify high levels of inflammation from certain foods. Someone might be eating a food every day that's causing inflammation in their body. So sometimes that can be a really good solution there. A lot of the tests on the market aren't great. So you got to make sure you get the right one. And that's something that I do. But essentially, you want to work toward reducing inflammation through food. They're coming out with these really awesome dietary inflammatory indexes to understand, what's most inflammatory for people. Someone's asking about cortisol in the body and, heavy food, drinks like coffee. I have had a lot of success getting people to take a break from caffeine. I think it's an underrated tool. I think people assume that, you know, coffee is good for you and that, you know, if you drink it every day, it'll promote your health. But less often do people take a 3-day break. You know, I think it's really important for people with histories of addictions to take a short break from coffees and caffeine. Sometimes you need to taper off, but a lot of times people feel so much better and didn't really realize that it was activating stress responses. And it's such a smart thing to do. I do recommend 3-day caffeine breaks at least once a year. Sometimes you realize that you didn't really need it in the first place at all. Someone's asking about different testing in different states. Yeah, it's hard for me to be able to know that. But, you know, if you send a, you know, email, I can tell you what kind of test that I recommend. I'm happy to be helpful. I do respond to direct messages on Instagram. I love being helpful to people in my recovery community, particularly those that have struggled with disordered eating and are really looking for answers. And I think we covered a lot today, and I'm really thrilled that we have so much participation. Recommended reading, social to follow. I'd say that, you know, hopefully I'm going to be putting out a couple new publications soon. I have a newsletter. If you go to nutritionandrecovery.com and you sign up for my newsletter, I put out 1 or 2 emails per month with great content on these things, and I share my publications and my work. I'm pretty active on Instagram as well. I really appreciate the support. Great. Thank you all.